The Texas sun burned hot over the Whitmore plantation in June 1863. The heavy air smelled of ripe cotton and the sweat of tired people working under the harsh sky. In the long rows of cotton plants, one woman stood out, not because she was tall or strong, but because of her eyes. Her eyes held storms inside them, memories of pain carved deep into her soul. Before we continue with Evelyn's powerful story of strength and justice, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us share more untold stories of courage and survival. Now, let's step into Evelyn's world. Evelyn was 32, but she looked older, worn down by a lifetime of suffering. Her rough hands knew every part of the cotton plants, every thorn that cut her skin, and every drop of blood she had shed on that land. She had been born into slavery on a small plantation in Louisiana. At age 12, she was sold when her first owner fell into debt. At 19, she was sold again, this time to the Whitmore plantation in eastern Texas. She had survived 14 years under the Whitmore family. 14 years of hard labor, humiliation, and a special kind of cruelty that came not from the master, but from his wife. Margaret Whitmore was full of contradictions. To visitors and other plantation families, she seemed like a perfect lady, kind, elegant, religious, and generous. She wore fine dresses, hosted tea parties, talked about books and fashion, and donated money to the church. Her smile was always gentle, her voice soft and polite, but behind closed doors, Margaret was someone entirely different. She had a mean and vengeful heart. While her husband, Charles, managed the business side of the plantation, Margaret controlled the house slaves with harsh discipline. She especially enjoyed punishing the women. Evelyn learned this within her first month there. One small mistake, a teacup slightly out of place, earned her 10 lashes. Margaret watched from the porch, calmly sipping lemonade, giving comments on the overseer's technique. That was the first time Evelyn saw the whipping tree. It was a huge oak tree near the main house. Its branches stretched wide like arms waiting to judge. The ground beneath was worn from the feet of many people who had been tied there. The bark was scarred from ropes, and the roots had soaked up the blood of the punished. Margaret chose this tree because everyone working in the fields could see it. She wanted the screams to spread across the plantation as a reminder of her power. Evelyn had been tied to that tree more times than she could count. 5 lashes for serving dinner late, 15 for a wrinkle in a tablecloth, 20 for looking Margaret in the eyes for too long. The overseer, Jeremiah Cobb, carried out the punishments. He was a cruel man who clearly enjoyed his job. Margaret watched every lash calmly, as if she were watching a garden party instead of a beating. Other women suffered even worse. Sarah, a young and beautiful woman, was whipped so badly that her back was permanently scarred. Margaret feared her husband might notice Sarah, so she had her sold to another plantation in Mississippi. Sarah was torn from her mother and siblings to serve as a warning to others. Prudence, an older midwife, tried to help a young mother who was forced to work through childbirth. When both mother and child died, Margaret blamed Prudence and had her whipped 30 times, even though Prudence was nearly 60. Prudence survived, but never recovered. Evelyn held all these memories inside her. Every scream from the whipping tree, every separated family, every injustice. Each one added fuel to a quiet fire burning in her heart. Margaret made everything worse by pretending her cruelty was holy. She quoted scripture while ordering punishments. She claimed slavery was God's will and that her discipline was a form of charity. She went to church every Sunday and returned home to punish someone without feeling any contradiction. Charles, her husband, was cruel in a different way. He wasn't emotional or violent. Instead, he treated enslaved people like numbers on a page, tools to create profit. He separated families when it made financial sense and sold children if the price was right. He didn't get his hands dirty, but he was responsible all the same. In 1863, the plantation lived in tension. The Civil War had been going on for 2 years. Rumors about President Lincoln and freedom spread slowly through Texas, but the Whitmores acted as if nothing could touch their world. Evelyn listened to every scrap of news. She secretly learned to read from an elderly slave named Moses. Reading was dangerous, punishable by death, but Moses believed knowledge was a kind of freedom. Evelyn learned fast and read newspapers when she could, interpreting what was hidden beneath Confederate lies. She learned about rebellions and heroes, Nat Turner, Harriet Tubman, Denmark Vesey. She learned that resistance had always existed, that enslaved people had fought back in many ways. These stories lit a spark inside her. In the spring of 1863, something changed in Evelyn. Maybe it was years of pain. Maybe it was the signs that the world outside was shifting. Or maybe it was one incident that pushed her too far. One evening, Margaret lost a piece of jewelry, a brooch, and immediately accused Evelyn. Even though Evelyn had been in the kitchen all day with witnesses, Margaret did not care. She needed someone to blame. She also suspected Evelyn was smarter than she should be, and she wanted to break her spirit. Evelyn was sentenced to 25 lashes the next morning. As Evelyn lay in her small, crowded sleeping quarters that night, she realized she had reached her limit. She could continue surviving and hoping for freedom someday, or she could take a risk, even if it meant death. The next morning was gray and threatening rain. Jeremiah Cobb dragged Evelyn to the whipping tree. Other slaves were forced to watch. Margaret arrived in a fancy dress, holding her parasol as if attending a picnic. She gave Cobb the signal to begin. Evelyn was tied to the tree. The whip cracked through the air. But before the first lash, she turned her head and looked straight at Margaret with burning eyes. Margaret stepped back, surprised. Then Evelyn spoke 4 words that changed everything. "God sees your sin." Silence fell over the plantation. Even the birds quieted. Margaret's face shifted from shock to fury, and then to something else, fear or guilt. Cobb hesitated, but Margaret ordered, 40 lashes. The whipping began. Evelyn gasped, but never screamed. By the 40th lash, she was unconscious. Margaret watched, but the words echoed in her mind. She couldn't ignore them. They shook her. The slaves carried Evelyn back to the quarters. Margaret pretended nothing was wrong, but the day felt strange and unsettled. The women cared for Evelyn for 3 days as she drifted in and out of fevered dreams. She remembered her mother's last words, "Remember who you are." She remembered the auction block, the songs of secret hope, the hidden gatherings, the lessons Moses taught her. Instead of breaking her, the whipping clarified her. She felt certain she would not die a slave. She would resist, even if it cost her life. On the 4th day, Moses visited her. He told her quietly, "You broke the spell of fear. Everyone heard you. That's dangerous and precious." He told her there were plans for a group escape involving 30 or 40 people from multiple plantations. Guides, routes, moonless nights. It was risky, but possible. Evelyn felt hope, but also something deeper. She wanted justice. Weeks passed. Evelyn healed and returned to work. Margaret's cruelty continued. But Evelyn watched carefully, gathering information, learning the routines of the house. Then a turning point. Charles Whitmore had to leave the plantation for 6 weeks. Margaret would be alone with Cobb. Secret meetings increased. The escape date moved closer. Then Evelyn found something, a heavy iron key on Margaret's vanity. It unlocked the punishment chains used near the whipping tree. The moment she held the key, a plan formed, dangerous, wild, but powerful. She took the key, made a wax copy that night, and prepared for what she knew she must do. Evelyn looked at Margaret and said, "I'm not going to kill you. I'm not even going to whip you as many times as you whipped me. You will get only 10 lashes, 1 for every year I've lived on this plantation. Then I'll leave you alive so you can think about what it feels like to be powerless, to depend on someone else's mercy, and to know that your pain means nothing to the person hurting you. She raised the whip. The first strike made a loud crack, the same sound Evelyn had heard many times before, except now she was the one holding the whip. The leather hit Margaret's back through her fancy dress, and Margaret screamed in shock and pain. The sound echoed through the small storage building. Evelyn felt the weight of the whip and the pull as it struck flesh. What she felt was complicated, not happiness, but a feeling that something in the world was finally balanced, even if only for a moment. She counted each lash out loud, her voice calm. 2, 3, 4. Each number reminded her of a memory, a moment of cruelty that Margaret had caused, a face of someone who had suffered under her rule. With the 5th lash, she thought of Sarah, who was sold away. With the 6th, she remembered Prudence, who was whipped for something she didn't do. With the 7th, she remembered her own mother, Ruth, torn from her arms because of the system Margaret supported so eagerly. Margaret's screams turned into desperate crying. "Stop! Please stop! I'm sorry!" she sobbed. Maybe it was the first real apology she had ever spoken to someone she enslaved, but Evelyn kept going until she reached 10 lashes, just as she promised. When she finished, Evelyn lowered the whip. Her arm trembled from effort and emotion. Margaret hung in her chains, her dress ripped and blood-stained, her face wet with tears and snot. She no longer looked like the proud, powerful mistress of the plantation. She looked like any human being in pain and fear, stripped of the status that had once protected her. Evelyn stared at her for a long moment. She felt a grim satisfaction, but also sadness. This whipping didn't change the world. It didn't free everyone still working in the fields. It didn't bring back those who had been sold or killed. It didn't undo 14 years of cruelty. It was only one small act of resistance, one brief moment when power shifted. "Do you understand now?" Evelyn asked softly. "Do you understand even a little of what you've done to others? 10 lashes compared to the hundreds you ordered. 10 lashes compared to the years of suffering you caused." Margaret could only cry. Her body shook with pain and fear. Evelyn set the whip on the ground and stepped closer. "Remember this feeling," she said. "Remember it for the rest of your life. Remember what it's like to be powerless, to have someone else decide if you suffer or live or die. Remember that we are human beings, Margaret. Every one of us you beat or sold, we feel pain just like you." Evelyn turned to leave, but Margaret choked out, "You'll never make it. They'll hunt you down. They'll bring you back in chains. And when they do, I'll make your death slow. So slow you'll beg for a normal whipping." Evelyn looked back over her shoulder. "Maybe they'll catch us. Maybe freedom won't come. But at least we will have tried. At least we chose hope instead of despair. What will you have, Margaret, when the war ends and your world collapses? You'll have memories of the pain you caused, and nothing more." Evelyn walked out of the building without looking back. Outside, the sun was bright, and the plantation was quiet. The field workers were far away in the cotton rows, too far to hear anything. The house slaves had been told to stay inside and pretend everything was normal. Evelyn returned to the slave quarters to gather the few things she owned: a spare dress, a small bag with bread and dried meat, letters Moses had taught her to read, and a wooden carving her mother had made before she was sold. Everything she owned fit in one small cloth bundle. She changed out of her house slave dress into rougher clothes that were better for travel. Then she went to find Moses. He was waiting for her. "Is it done?" he asked. "It's done," she said. "Margaret is alive. She'll be found eventually. Cobb will notice when she doesn't come to supper, and someone will hear her screaming, but by then we'll have hours of head start." Moses nodded. "Everyone who's coming is ready. We need to leave within the hour." They walked toward the meeting point, passing the familiar places of the plantation, places that had been both home and prison, the cotton fields, the big house, the whipping tree. She looked at all of it with the knowledge that she would never see it again. In the woods, 37 people were waiting. Some were teenagers, others elderly, families, couples, people traveling alone, field workers with scars, house slaves who had seen the cruelty up close, craftsmen whose labor had enriched others, and women who had lost children. They all had their own reasons for running. They all had their own pain. They were quiet but determined. The escape had been planned for weeks. They had guides who knew the routes. They had passwords, maps, and methods to avoid detection. Moses gave a brief prayer. "Tonight we cross Jordan," he said, using the secret language enslaved people used to speak of freedom. "Some may fall, but those who reach the other side will be free." One small group left, then another, then another. Evelyn left with Moses and a few others. As they moved through the woods, the sounds of the plantation faded. Ahead of them lay danger and possibility. They traveled all night, crossing streams, pushing through brush, following the stars. At dawn they had gone about 15 miles. They were exhausted, but they had made it through the first night. They hid in a ravine during the day, setting guards. Evelyn couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Margaret, the whip, the screams, the risk they were all taking. Moses noticed and spoke gently. "You wondering if you did the right thing?" "Not wondering," she said, "just thinking about what it means." "It changed something," Moses said. "Maybe not the whole world, but it changed you. Maybe it changed Margaret too, and everyone who hears what you did, they'll carry that story. It matters." "Does it matter enough to risk lives?" she asked. "Everyone here made their own choice," Moses replied. "Some because of the war, some because they couldn't stay another day, and some because your story gave them hope." They moved again the next day. It was harder, feet bleeding, stomachs empty, fear constant. They avoided roads, waded through streams to hide their scent, and traveled through forests for cover. On the second day they reached a river swollen from rain. It was dangerous, but they had no choice. They crossed using ropes and human chains. 2 people almost drowned, but in the end all 37 made it across. After resting briefly, they kept moving. By night they had covered nearly 40 miles. They knew that pursuers would now be looking for them. On the 3rd day, a scout returned with news. 8 mounted men with dogs were tracking them. The group split into smaller groups to make it harder to catch them. Evelyn stayed with 6 others, Moses, Clara, Ruth, Samuel, the healer Denina, and Marcus the blacksmith. They traveled mostly at night, hiding during the day. On the 5th day, they nearly got caught. Dogs approached, men shouting. They froze, ready to fight or run. But then the dogs moved away, following another scent. The group stayed still for an hour before breathing normally again. "We're ghosts now," Moses said that night. "Every mile is a victory." By the end of the week they had traveled 80 miles, exhausted, hungry, hurt, but still free. They saw signs of the war, abandoned farms, destroyed houses, battle sounds in the distance. They took food from empty homes. They met other escapees. A few brave people helped them. On the 10th day, they crossed into Arkansas. They were told Union soldiers were 60 miles to the northeast and were accepting escaped slaves. The last stretch would be the hardest, but it was possible. They traveled 3 more days through dangerous territory, hiding from Confederate patrols. On the 13th day, at dawn, they saw it, the United States flag flying over a camp. The Union lines. They approached slowly, but when the soldiers saw them, they did not threaten them. They offered food, water, and dignity. A Union officer took their names. When he reached Evelyn, she said clearly, "I am Evelyn of Texas. I was enslaved on the Whitmore plantation for 14 years. Before I escaped, I gave my mistress 10 lashes at the same tree where she had me whipped. Write that down. I want it remembered." He nodded and wrote it. In the following days, she learned that 4 of the 5 groups had made it. 31 of the 37 were free. 6 had died or been captured. Evelyn and her group survived. They were placed in a contraband camp. They worked for wages, learned to read and write, and began building new lives. Evelyn's story spread. The tale of the enslaved woman who whipped her mistress became a symbol of resistance. Margaret survived but was mentally broken. She jumped at shadows, refused to be alone with slaves, and eventually fled the plantation. When the war ended, the Whitmore plantation collapsed along with it. Evelyn lived the rest of her life helping others, teaching, organizing, telling stories of slavery and freedom. She never married but became a mother figure to many. She died at 67, still carrying the memories of those who suffered and those who fought for freedom. The whipping tree stood for decades afterward, a silent witness to both cruelty and resistance. Though the world eventually forgot her story, black communities passed it down, keeping alive the truth that even in the darkest times, people resisted, survived, and fought for justice. After reaching the Union lines, Evelyn slowly began to adjust to life as a free woman. The relief of escape was only the beginning. Freedom was not just leaving slavery behind, but learning to live in a world that still held prejudice, danger, and uncertainty. In the contraband camp, she found work helping to organize shelters, distribute food, and tend to the sick. Every day she saw the physical and emotional scars left by bondage. Children who had never known a home, adults who had been broken by whippings and labor, women who had lost their children. Evelyn carried these faces in her mind, and in every action she took, she sought to preserve their dignity. Evelyn learned to read and write more fluently, and it quickly became clear that her skill with letters could serve a purpose far beyond survival. She began teaching other freed people, adults and children alike, reading, writing, and arithmetic. Every lesson was an act of resistance, a reclamation of knowledge denied to generations under slavery. She reminded them that literacy was freedom in itself, a tool to claim their place in a society that still sought to define them by color and the labor they performed. She became known as Miss Evelyn, a figure of quiet authority and inspiration. Her students came to her not just for instruction, but for guidance, for stories of courage, for hope. Evelyn's story of the whipping at the plantation and her escape spread like wildfire among the freed and those still in bondage. To some, it was mythic, a single act of defiance that had toppled the power of a mistress, if only for a moment. To others, it was a blueprint of bravery. Her story was whispered in fields, passed from traveler to traveler, a reminder that the bonds of oppression could be broken by courage, intelligence, and resolve. Every retelling reinforced the truth that enslaved people were not passive victims. They were fighters, strategists, and survivors. As Reconstruction began, Evelyn became an outspoken advocate for education and civil rights. She testified at gatherings, church meetings, and community councils. She spoke about her experiences not with hatred, but with a clear moral purpose, to show that the system of slavery was unjust, that freedom was not simply a gift, but a right that had been stolen, and that justice required more than legal abolition. It required recognition of humanity, opportunity, and equality. She taught that resistance, whether small or large, was part of a collective effort to reshape society, and that stories like hers were essential to understanding both the horrors endured and the resilience cultivated. Though the Whitmore plantation and its owners faded into history, Evelyn carried their memory with her, not as a burden of vengeance, but as a reminder of the stakes of justice. Every person who had been sold, beaten, or oppressed lived on in her storytelling, her teaching, and her relentless commitment to uplift others. The whipping tree, she would tell her students, was not just a symbol of cruelty. It was a symbol of courage, a proof that even when the world sought to render you powerless, the human spirit could assert its dignity. Evelyn never married, never bore children, but she nurtured generations. She was a mother to orphans, a mentor to young activists, a teacher to children seeking to claim their futures. She helped families locate relatives separated by sales and auctions. She documented names, dates, and stories, ensuring that the history of slavery would not be erased by silence or by those who wanted to romanticize the past. In every action, she turned her suffering into empowerment, her pain into purpose. In the final decades of her life, Evelyn became a revered figure in her community. People came to her not only for practical guidance, but for moral counsel. She had seen the worst of humanity and survived it. She had felt the power of resistance and used it wisely. And even as the broader nation often turned its back on the promises of reconstruction, Evelyn embodied the persistence of hope, the assertion of dignity, and the unbreakable will to claim freedom in every sense of the word. When Evelyn died at age 67 in 1898, her passing was mourned by many whose lives she had touched, and her story lived on in the communities she had nurtured. The descendants of those she had taught, inspired, and protected carried her legacy forward. They remembered the woman who had once stood at the whipping tree, a symbol of resistance and courage, and survived to teach, heal, and lead. Evelyn's life proved that freedom was never only about escaping chains. It was about reclaiming humanity, asserting one's worth, and building a better world for those who would follow. Her story, once nearly lost, has since been recovered by historians and storytellers seeking to honor the real acts of resistance that ordinary enslaved people carried out every day. Evelyn of Texas reminds us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. That justice sometimes requires bold, dangerous, and morally complex choices. That resistance, even when it cannot overturn an entire system, can ripple outward, inspiring others, shifting minds, and leaving a mark that lasts for generations. Even after Evelyn passed, her influence continued to resonate. In the years following her death, the communities she had helped nurture became hubs of education, resilience, and advocacy. Former slaves, their children and grandchildren carried forward the lessons she had imparted: literacy as empowerment, courage as a tool of justice, and resistance as a moral imperative. Churches and schools she had helped establish became centers of organizing during the early 20th century, preparing generations to challenge segregation, disenfranchisement, and systemic inequality. Her story, the whipping at the Whitmore plantation, the daring escape, and her life of service, became a symbol, whispered in kitchens, passed down at church gatherings, and eventually documented by historians dedicated to recovering the lost narratives of enslaved people. Evelyn was no longer just a woman of flesh and blood. She became an emblem of resistance, a moral compass showing that even in the face of overwhelming oppression, one person's actions could inspire collective courage. As the Jim Crow era tightened its grip across the South, Evelyn's narrative served as a quiet reminder that freedom and dignity were never fully granted. They were claimed. Her former students, some of whom had become teachers themselves, shared her story in schools, emphasizing the power of self-determination and moral courage. It was not just about the historical whipping of Margaret Whitmore. It was about the principle that human beings could challenge injustice and insist upon their own humanity, even when the world denied it. By the mid-20th century, Evelyn's story intersected with the emerging civil rights movement. Activists and educators drew inspiration from her life, seeing in her experiences a lineage of defiance and moral clarity. She became part of a collective memory of resistance that extended from the enslaved people of the 19th century to the leaders and ordinary citizens demanding justice in the 20th century. Her actions at the Whitmore plantation were taught as examples of moral courage, illustrating the idea that justice is not only delivered in courts or legislation, it is also enacted by individuals who refuse to accept the dehumanization imposed upon them. The whipping tree itself, long a silent witness, became a site of remembrance. Though it had aged and weathered decades of neglect, local communities pointed it out to visitors as a living monument. Children were told about Evelyn, the courage she embodied, and the liberation she achieved, teaching them that the fight for dignity often begins with small acts of bravery and the insistence on being recognized as fully human. Today, historians, educators, and storytellers continue to uncover and amplify stories like Evelyn's. They remind us that history is not only written by the victors or by those in power, it is also written by those who resist, who survive, and who insist upon telling the truth of their lives. Evelyn of Texas is remembered not just as the woman who whipped her mistress at the tree where she herself had suffered, but as a figure whose life exemplified the endurance of the human spirit, the necessity of resistance, and the transformative power of education and community. Her story is a bridge between past and present, a reminder that courage, justice, and humanity are timeless. In every retelling, Evelyn continues to speak to those who seek freedom in any form, freedom from oppression, ignorance, fear, or despair. She challenges each generation to consider, when faced with injustice, will we act? Will we resist? Will we claim our humanity, even when the odds are overwhelming? The answer lies in the choices we make, inspired by those like Evelyn, whose life proves that one act of courage can ripple through history and shape the lives of countless others. Even decades after Evelyn's death, her story continues to resonate because it speaks to a universal truth. The fight for justice is ongoing, and acts of courage, no matter how small they may seem, can ripple through generations. Historians and educators have worked to ensure that tales like hers are not lost to time, recognizing that the experiences of enslaved people were not passive narratives of suffering, but active stories of resistance, resilience, and humanity. Evelyn's defiance at the whipping tree became more than a moment of personal vindication. It became a symbol of collective empowerment, proof that oppression could be challenged and that one individual could inspire many. Her life reminds us that history is not only shaped by the powerful, but also by those who refuse to accept injustice. In classrooms, museums, and community storytelling, Evelyn's narrative is used to illustrate the moral complexities of slavery, the courage required to resist it, and the long path toward freedom and equality. It teaches that justice is not always delivered by courts or governments, but sometimes emerges from the bravery and moral clarity of those willing to act in the face of danger. Evelyn's legacy is also a reminder that freedom is not merely the absence of chains, but the presence of dignity, opportunity, and the ability to claim one's own story. Through her teaching and community work, she helped others navigate their newfound freedom, passing down knowledge, skills, and the wisdom of resilience. Her insistence that Margaret Whitmore's punishment be remembered underscores the importance of accountability and bearing witness, principles that continue to inform discussions of justice and reparations today. The story of Evelyn of Texas also challenges contemporary society to consider its own responses to oppression and injustice. It asks, what will we do when faced with systemic inequality, cruelty, or abuse of power? Will we act to protect the vulnerable and confront wrongdoing, or will we remain passive, content to let history repeat itself? Evelyn's courage, her determination to seize her own freedom and empower others, offers a template for moral action. Resistance is not only a right but a responsibility, and even in the face of overwhelming odds, individual acts of courage can spark broader change. Ultimately, Evelyn's life demonstrates the enduring power of memory, storytelling, and moral courage. She transformed her pain into purpose, her suffering into strategy, and her escape into a life dedicated to the empowerment of others. Her story, preserved through oral histories, written records, and scholarly research, is a reminder that the past is never truly past, and that the lessons of courage, resistance, and the pursuit of justice are timeless. Evelyn of Texas is remembered not merely for surviving slavery, but for embodying the principles of human dignity and justice in a world that had systematically denied both. Her life continues to teach, inspire, and challenge all who hear it, proving that even in the darkest chapters of history, the light of courage and resistance can shine through. The moral of the story is that even in the darkest oppression, courage, resilience, and the refusal to accept injustice can reclaim dignity, inspire others, and create real change. True freedom comes not just from escape, but from standing up for one's humanity and ensuring that acts of resistance are remembered.